Well, good evening, comrades, and thank you all for joining us tonight. The slightly earlier start time than usual. This is the latest in the series of fortnightly discussions which are hosted by Talking About Socialism. Obviously, there are some familiar faces here, but if this is your first meeting of ours that you've been to, you're very welcome. Tonight we have a very interesting discussion on a crucial topic at the present moment. We have Moshé Machover speaking on the latest developments in Israel and Palestine. Moshé is an author of several books on this topic and on other books, and a well-known speaker on this topic in our movement. And so we're very glad and very appreciative that he's agreed to join us tonight and speak. I want to go over some housekeeping before we do that. As is always the case with these online meetings, we are recording the meeting so that it can be put on our YouTube channel later. We'll circulate details of that. And it's also being live streamed to Facebook. So just be aware of that, that the entire meeting is being live streamed. In terms of how the discussion tonight is going to look, we're going to have a 15-minute introduction from Moshé, and then there are going to be plenty of contributions from the floor. That's what we put a real emphasis on in these discussions, having lots of back and forth and debate and contributions. I'm going to be chairing. There is, of course, we are quite strict about timings to make sure that everything runs efficiently and everyone gets a say. And so contributions from the floor are going to be limited to 3 minutes, and I will cut you off for 3 minutes just to make sure that everybody gets a chance to be heard. So we'll take a number of contributions, and at periodic intervals, I'm going to invite Moshé to come back and respond to points raised, answer questions, and elaborate on any further points that he wishes to make. In terms of being called in to speak, you all have access to a Zoom virtual hand, which you can usually access from the bottom of your screen. Please try and use that if possible. It makes the chair's life a lot easier just to see who's waiting to speak. But if for any reason you can't, you can put a message in the chat, or if need be, you can raise a physical hand and we'll do our best to look out for you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Moshé and ask him to introduce tonight's discussion for 15 minutes.
Thank you, comrades. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I must disappoint you right from the beginning. I'm not going to talk about latest development. There's a lot that you can see in the media, and I don't think elaborating on what you are probably exposed to or even overexposed to is going to add anything. In any case, a quarter of an hour would not be enough to cover latest development. What I propose doing is try to give you what I regard as the key to understanding what the historical context of what is happening now is. I mean, to really place present events in their historical context. As the General Secretary of the United Nations said, this is not happening in a vacuum. And possibly with this key, we may be able to try to predict what is going to happen. Of course, predictions are never certain, but we may be able to make probability predictions. What is probable to be happening in the future. So without further ado, I want to start placing the conflict that is unfolding now in its historical and theoretically Marxist context. So the first thing to understand is that what we have here between Israel and the Palestinian, in fact, between the Zionist project and its Palestinian objects, is a colonial conflict. This is precept number one. Without getting this most fundamental point, you fail to understand the whole chain of events from the beginning of this conflict till today, and to look at the future. I mean, if you listen to the way that this conflict is depicted in the mainstream media, even not necessarily those that are hostile to the Palestinians, you get a sort of symmetric view. There is a conflict between two nations, or between two religions, sometimes even worse, between two religions, the Israelis and the Palestinians. Of course, the more tendentious depiction is here. There is the state of Israel, and there are these Palestinians who keep attacking it. They somehow don't accept the existence, the legitimacy of the state of Israel. There's something wrong, and Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course, this is nonsense. Saying that the conflict is colonial is not a value judgment. It is a statement of fact. In fact, this is how the Zionist project defined itself in the early days, before the word colonialism and colonization became sort of suspect or no, politically incorrect, as it were. In its early days, and until quite late, in the Zionist literature itself, the project was described as a project of colonization of Palestine by Jews in order to create a Jewish nation state. That was how it was defined by the Zionists themselves. Having said this, this is only not even half of the story, because colonizations and colonial conflicts come in several varieties. There have in fact been three types, and I'm using here the Marxist classification of colonial conflicts. You will often hear that the Zionist colonization is a species or a case of settler colonialism, right? Now, I want to question this, put a query on this designation. The term settler colonialism comes from the academic discourse known as post-colonial discourse. The academics who criticize colonialism and who investigate colonialism have designated this type of colonization to which the Zionist case belongs as settler colonialism. This is misleading because you will often hear that the Zionist colonization of Palestine is lumped together in the same category as the colonization of South Africa under apartheid. Both are settler colonialism. I say that this is highly misleading because if you take a Marxist point of view and look at the political economy, the Zionist colonization and South Africa represent two very different kinds, very different species of colonization. Marx actually described very briefly in Capital Volume 1 3 types of colonization. One is irrelevant to the present discussion, and that is plantation colonies based on slavery. Now, it's clear that this is not relevant to the present case. The other two were elaborated further by Kautsky in his 1909 fundamental article about colonialism. He got many things wrong, but his classification was basically right in Marxist terms. You look at the political economy, and the political economy is primarily a question of who are the direct producers, what kind of production is going on there. And here you will find that apart from plantation colonies based on slavery, there have been 2 types of colonization in modern history. One was a colonization where the settlers were after the resources of the country being colonized, including the labor force of the indigenous people. In this type of colony, the direct producers, the majority of the population, because the direct producers are always the majority of the population, are the indigenous people, and the settlers formed a kind of quasi-class. The other type of colonization was what you had in the north of the United States, what became the northern part of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Here, the native population, the indigenous people, were not the main source of labor power for the political economy. Okay. The majority of the direct producers were themselves settlers. Okay, that's what happened in Australia. That's what happened in Palestine. Now, these two, and of course, in South Africa, you had the opposite. In South Africa, the majority of the direct producers were indigenous people. So if both Israel, Palestine, and South Africa belong to the same category, then the category itself is misleading. You have to take a classification based on the political economy. The difference is momentous. It has all sorts of consequences that are, some of them obvious, some of them not so obvious. In the type of colonization represented by South Africa and many other colonies, predominantly in Africa itself, the settlers coalesced into a kind of quasi-class, an exploitative quasi-class. They remained a minority of the population. The population distribution, consisted of a relatively small minority of settlers and a vast majority of indigenous people. In the other type of colonization, which I would term for the purpose of this discussion as exclusion colonies, that is to say, where the indigenous population was excluded from the political economy of the the colony, the resources like land and so on was taken over by the settlers in steps, in degrees, as a process. But the indigenous people itself was surplus to requirement. In all of the latter type of colonies, the settlers coalesced, crystallized as a new nation. You had a new Australian nation, a new American nation. There is a new nation in Israel, resulting from the Zionist colonization, which consciously chose this model of colonization, not relying on the indigenous people as source of labor power. Why? I mean, from the beginning, the aim of Zionist colonization was explicitly to colonize Palestine in order to constitute a Jewish nation state. Now, you don't get a Jewish nation state if you rely on the labor power of the indigenous people, because the direct producers are always the majority. Now, the main, one of the additional main difference between the two types is that all the decolonizations that occurred in the second half of the 20th century, the whole spate of decolonization was exclusively related to colonies in which the indigenous people were the majority of the direct producers. I don't want to go into the details, but if you look, all cases of decolonization belong to this type. The latest of those were Algeria and South Africa. There was a reason why it took longer to decolonize Algeria and to decolonize South Africa, briefly because there was an exceptional situation there where the settlers had their own military force, military organization that did not require constant direct protection by the army of the mother country. Now, if you look at the case of Zionist colonization, I said it belonged to this latter type, the exclusion type of colonization. But within this category, it is a very exceptional and unique case. You cannot equate the colonization of Palestine to the colonization of Australia, for example. For one thing which is obvious, it is anachronistic. It has come late. This type of colonization elsewhere came to its resolution, as it were, always in favor of the settlers by the beginning of the 20th century. The conflict between colonizers and colonized was resolved in favor of the colonizers, who managed either to ethnically cleanse the indigenous people and or to overwhelm them numerically. In this sense, the Zionist colonization of Palestine is historically very late. It started where all other colonizations of this type were in the history book. So you must understand that Zionist colonization is still a work in progress. It is not complete. And you can see this by the demographic balance. If you look at all colonizations of the type of South Africa, okay, of the type of the other colonies in Africa. As I said, the settlers were a small minority. The indigenous people constituted the vast majority of the population. This was a typical ethnic balance. In the other type, if you look at Australia, if you look at the United States, if you look at Canada, the situation, the demographic balance is the opposite. You have an overwhelmed or extinct, to some extent, decimated indigenous population with an overwhelming majority of settlers. This is what happened. I mean, in the case of Tasmania, the indigenous people was actually annihilated. Very few individuals remained. In other places, it was not so extreme. But what you had towards the end of the process, and that was completed by the beginning of the 20th century, certainly even by the end of the 19th century, you had an overwhelming majority of settlers and a small, if at all, indigenous population. Either it disappeared completely, ethnically cleansed, or it was reduced to remnants of the previous majority. What do we have in Palestine? We have in Palestine a demographic balance in which neither the one nor the other, neither the settlers nor the indigenous people are the majority. In fact, they are at present more or less equal in numerical. This indicates that the process is at an unstable juncture and it is incomplete. We don't see this because the cases of the colonization of America, of Australia, and so on is now in the history books. But what we are witnessing in the case of Palestine is work in progress. That is to say, the direction of development is towards increasing ethnic cleansing until from the point of view of the Zionist settlers, until the indigenous population either disappears or is reduced to a small minority. This indicates that the direction is that of ethnic cleansing. And if you look at the history of Zionist colonization from the beginning of the 20th century, you will see that in stages, the indigenous population was reduced to a minority. First of all, the biggest step in this direction was the 1947-49 war. What Israel calls its war of independence is what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. This was a stage in the process of ethnic cleansing. The Nakba in itself constituted ethnic cleansing of the majority of the Palestinians that were left in what became Israel. What became Israel, however, was not the whole of Palestine. The Zionist aim, formulated many times, most importantly in the so-called Biltmore Conference of May 1942, was the whole of Palestine as a Jewish state. Now, what happened as a result of the 1948 war was a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, but not in the whole of Palestine. Zionist fundamentalists, and not only as a marginal minority, but the mainstream, regarded this as a mission incomplete. The next stage came in the War of 1967, the June War of 1967. And mind you, I mean, in every case where a further stage of ethnic cleansing happens, it was always, as it were, in response to attack by the indigenous people or by the Arab state. If you look at the Israeli version of what happened in 1948, we were attacked by the Arab states and by the indigenous Palestinians. And as a response, as self-defense, we had to take 3/4 roughly of Palestine, over and above what the United Nations resolved to allocate to a Jewish state in its 1947 resolution. In 1967 as well, the picture that you get from the way it is told in the Zionist narrative, Israel was attacked or about to be attacked. In fact, it wasn't. This was a fabricated hysteria. It was not about to be attacked. But never mind. In response, in self-defense against being attacked or the danger of being attacked in 1967, Israel expanded its domain to include the whole of historical Palestine, and in addition also part of Syria. It is not to be forgotten that Israel is controlling not only the Palestinian areas conquered in 1967, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but also a bit of Syria, the Golan Heights, which Israel annexed. And it is clear that the Syrian Golan Heights were annexed to Israel. This was made possible from the point of view of Israeli colonialism because the population of the Syrian Golan Heights was by and large ethnically cleansed. The dilemma for the Zionist state is that it is now ruling over the whole of historical Palestine plus a bit of Syria, but it hasn't achieved a Jewish majority there. From the viewpoint of the Zionist project, this can only be resolved by somehow getting rid of a big chunk of the population of the Palestinian population of Palestine. You are actually witnessing part of this process at the moment. What is happening in Gaza is ethnic cleansing. If you actually look physically at what is happening, a million people are told to move from half of the Gaza Strip to where? This is ethnic cleansing in action. I mean, people refer to it as genocide. This may be a correct description, but this is a legal description. What I think we should focus on in order to understand what is going on is a political description of what is going on. Politically, it is ethnic cleansing. Genocide may be a legal way of defining. Similarly, when Israel is described as an apartheid state, this is legally correct according to the internationally accepted definition of apartheid. Israel is operating apartheid not only in the occupied territories, but also within pre-67 Israel. But this is a legalistic way of describing it. It is in some sense confusing because apartheid immediately invokes in your mind the situation in South Africa before the end of apartheid. Apartheid was a term coined in South Africa. Now, according to the international definition of apartheid, what Israel is implementing in its area under its control is a kind of apartheid, but it is not the same apartheid as in South Africa, for the reasons that I try to make clear. Another, I'm moving towards the end of I've been speaking for too long, but I want to make two further points. One further point is another unique feature about Zionist colonization compared to the other colonizations similar in kind, that is to say, of the exclusion type, is that in all other cases, there was a mother country, metropolis, that sent its own nationals to colonize a new territory and backed them. There was, the colonizers of Australia, of North America were largely British people, sent by Britain. The Zionist colonization had no mother country. It therefore had to rely on surrogate mothers. Its surrogate mothers were always a sequence of empires, those that were dominant in the area. It started, of course, I'm referring to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is, as it were, the instrument, the document by which Britain became the surrogate mother of Zionist colonization. This came to an end, and I don't want to go into the details of the history, but this came to an end in the 1940s. In fact, by 1939. There was a period then in which the surrogate mother of Zionist colonization was France. This is forgotten, but there was a period where the main protector, the big empire that played the role of surrogate mother was France. From the mid-60s, the surrogate mother was the United States. Israel was, in fact, the Zionist project was extremely successful in all sorts of ways, but one way in which it was successful was in forging useful alliances with its surrogate mother, providing useful services to the surrogate mother in return for its unwavering protection. And this is the way to understand the relationship between Israel and the Zionist regime and the United States. Israel is an extraordinary strategic asset of the United States, and in return, it is given extraordinary, unusual protection. Britain likes to boast that it has a special relationship with the United States. If you want to see a real special relationship, then look at the relationship between the United States and Israel, which is really extraordinary. I don't have to go into detail. Okay, how is it going to end? Where is it pointing to? If you look at the historical direction of development, then the probable evolution of this, further evolution of this conflict is a further bout of ethnic cleansing. I was predicting the danger of further ethnic cleansing in Palestine for a number of years now. This is based on the analysis of the nature of the conflict, the nature of Zionist colonization and the fact that the present situation where you have a demographic parity between colonizers and colonized is unstable from the point of view of the colonizers. This is not sustainable in the long run. Israel has made the idea of two-state solution an obvious deception. I mean, this is no longer even regarded as realizable, but by anybody who has any knowledge of the situation there. It has made it impossible. Why? Because Israel, the Zionist regime, has a claim, a historical claim from its point of view for the whole of Palestine. It's not going to allow the creation of another nation state there. The whole of Palestine is destined to be nation state of the Jewish people. How is it going to materialize this? Is it going to happen? Well, of course, nothing is certain. I mean, history is still open. The fact that the logic of the situation is pointing in this way doesn't mean that it's going to happen. A mechanism by which it is probably going to happen, or going to be at least tried, is something that I was a participant in pointing out 56 years ago. 56 years ago, my comrades and I published a statement, a very short statement, that depicts what is going to happen if Israel persists in the occupation of the Palestinian territories which it captured in 1967. The statement was published as an advertisement in Haaretz, the Israeli major newspaper, on the 22nd of September 1967. And its main part of the text is very short text, a few 50-something words. Occupation entails foreign rule. Foreign rule entails resistance. Resistance entails oppression. Oppression entails terror and counter-terror. This is what we said. If we hold on to the occupied territories, we will become a nation of murderers and murder victims. Now, this was a statement made 56 years ago. But within this statement, you will see not only a logical chain of causality, but also a direction of development. It pointed to the dynamic of the situation, because resistance invites oppression. This is if you like, law of history. The oppressor cannot respond to resistance by any, or does not know any way of responding to resistance, but except by further repression. Further repression escalates resistance. This is not a static process. It is a process of spiral escalation.
Moshé.
At some point, it leads to an explosion. From the Palestinian point of view, the only resolution, the only way they can respond to it is by escalating the resistance. From the point of view of the colonizer, the Zionist regime, there is a way out, namely further ethnic cleansing. Get rid of the whole process by ethnic cleansing. This is where it is heading. Will it be perpetrated? Well, it may be. It will require a major regional conflagration, which can happen in all sorts of ways. Can happen even tomorrow. But all sorts of things can happen to prevent it, including the disintegration of Israeli, or the erosion of Israeli society from within. Israeli society has become very unstable internally, which was demonstrated by the 40 weeks that preceded the present conflict, the present war, if you like, preceded the October this year. It is split down the middle, and it is pointed by the occupation itself. The fact that the microbes, the poison of occupation, seeps into Israeli society itself and makes it subject to sharpening internal conflict. It may be that this conflict will somehow intervene and prevent the possibility of Israel perpetrating ethnic cleansing. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict what is happening, but I can only end by saying that the logic of the process itself, as it has been unfolding from the beginning of the 20th century, points towards the likelihood of major further ethnic cleansing following this in the Gaza Strip. I'm talking about the West Bank and possibly Israel itself trying to ethnically cleanse part of its own Palestinian citizenry. Thank you. I've spoken for too long.
Moshé, that was brilliant, and you've given us so much there. So I'm sure that people are going to have any number of points that they want to make and questions that they want to raise. So I'm going to start taking contributions now. So if everybody could raise virtual hands, and I will take perhaps a batch of 5 people to begin with, and then we'll see where we go from there. So if I can see some hands raised, I will start calling people in. Should just say as well, if this is your first discussion that you've been to, your contribution is really welcome. However you want to phrase it, whether it's a question or a point that you'd like to make about a single issue, then please, by all means, come in. Your contribution is very welcome. So I'm going to take Phil first of all, and then, but keep raising those hands, everybody, and I'll maintain a list of who's waiting to speak. So go ahead, Phil.
No, yeah, sorry, I've got my camera off. I'm just trying to multitask, and that's not ideal. I suspect people aren't coming in because there was so much there, and it was so interesting. It's difficult to know quite what to, like, how do you add to that? I'm no expert on this, so I suppose mine's more of a sort of question. I think that laid out the history and some of the sort of understanding of how we got where we are. But I suppose Moshé didn't really talk about what useful roles socialists can play now. I mean, obviously there's the demonstrations and there's basic solidarity, and there's the desperate need just to stop the bombing in the here and now. That's our, what we can usefully do, pressure our own governments. But I suppose my question is, like, I'm no longer in it, but I was in the sort of militant Socialist Party tradition, and it emphasised a sort of revolution across the Middle East, the Arab states, and involving the Israeli working class as the solution. I'd just be interested in Moshé's or anyone else's thoughts about sort of whether that's really realistic given the status of the Israeli working class as a sort of colonial body. I don't claim to have any great insight. I'd be interested in, if socialism is part of the solution, how does that work with a group of workers who are quite distinct in terms of their sort of colonial relationship with the indigenous people? Does that make sense? I'm well out of my comfort zone with this.
No, that's a really excellent question, Phil. And obviously, it's one that may be difficult to answer, given as Moshé was talking about, the Israeli society and the Israeli colonial experience is kind of unique in history and a new experience. But I'm sure that Moshé will have opinions on what you've raised there. So we'll come back to him in a little while. I'm going to call John and then Gary in to speak. So John, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to give a short anecdote, and I've invited Moshé to speak later on in the week, so I might use the same anecdote then. But I'm from socialist democracy in Ireland, originally People's Democracy, and we're sort of mini Moshé in that back in '68, when the civil rights movement was set up to reform the northern state in Ireland, we took a position that the partition state couldn't be reformed. And everybody else fell out with us until eventually the Republicans fell out with us and we were on our own. And so 25 years ago, the sort of major attempt to reform the partition state was undertaken in the Good Friday Agreement. And actually, if you look around you now, none of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are actually standing, except the continued British presence in Ireland. So that's by the way. What I would like to say is that I agree with Moshé, but I think it's somewhat too historical. And because it's so historical, it tends to not deal so much with geopolitics. I think the most illuminating point that he made was that Israel was an orphan and it constantly needed, a surrogate imperial power to endorse Israel. And I think that means that there's been a number of Israels. That there was the Israel of 1948, and then there was the Israel of 1967, and that was quite a significant jump because that was the point at which major geopolitics became the bastion of the US in the Middle East, the gendarmerie of the US in the Middle East. And to a certain extent, I think what we're seeing now is the collapse of that region. Not the collapse, but it's run into sort of quagmire. It looked as if US sponsorship would lead to the Abraham Accords, would lead to the sidelining of Palestine and peace between the Arab world and Israel. And that actually looked set in stone. And then it was blown up by the Hamas uprising. And so, what we can say about the current situation is that the Arab world, in terms of its elites, have no interest at all in the Palestinian masses. And if they get away with it, would cheerfully allow the Israelis to ethnically cleanse the whole area, although they don't know where to put them because they don't want them in their territory. But they're in a very difficult situation because the position of the Arab masses is one of absolute horror, indignation, and demands for a response. And the idea that that will die away in a couple of months when the dust settles, I think it's not going to happen. But what I think is the big giant weakness is we're talking about the Arab street, the Arab masses, but we're not talking about the Arab working class, because the Arab working class are badly fragmented, especially since the counter-revolution in Egypt, which is where the Arab working class would be able to assert themselves. The only other thing I want to say is that we're suffering from a similar situation in Europe, in the sense that we're seeing this massive mobilization, and the massive mobilization is definitely having an effect, not enough of effect, but it is claiming victims. I would say that Suella Braverman is to a certain extent a victim, if that's the right word for Suella.
I'm going to ask you to just wrap up there, John, if that's okay.
Yeah. No, so the only other thing I want to say is what we have at the head of that mobilization is a very old-fashioned left. And it's an old-fashioned left isn't able to assert the centrality of the working class. So you have, in Belgium, for example, the banning by the trade unions of any movement of weapons to Israel. You have a movement on one arms factory in Britain. But basically, I would describe the movement as basically liberal, and they're an urgent need for a socialist backbone somewhere.
Thanks very much, John. Gary, you're up next.
Thanks. And that was a really helpful background framework, Moshé, that you summarised there. Well, I think we do have to look at what's going on now, as well as looking at the background. That's what I want to do. I also want to look at where we were in the days, months leading up to October the 7th, because resistance is not optional for the Palestinians. It's not like the repression dies down or goes away if Palestinians are not actively resisting. As we've seen in recent years, we also, as John just said, were facing normalization of relations with Israel across the Middle East. Started with a few states. Saudi was about to enter into a normalization Abraham Accord with Israel itself. That would have been utter disaster for the Palestinians, quite possibly the end of their future. And as Moshé was saying, to be frank, Palestinians cannot look to the Israeli working class for solidarity, even though in the previous year running up to October the 7th, there was huge splits and divisions within the Israeli community. Neither side of that split felt any solidarity whatsoever with Palestine. In fact, I would say that so people who expressed solidarity with Palestine on the streets in those demonstrations were harangued and abused and attacked. So it would be a complete fantasy to think that solidarity with the Israeli working class in any foreseeable future is going to solve anything for the Palestinians. So actually, yes, I celebrated the breakout from the Gaza prison on October the 7th. It was a brave and extremely astute act of resistance. And actually, as John said, it scuppered the Abraham Accords, and that was a hugely significant impact to have. I also think that actually what was done that day was much more complicated than our media would have us think. There was a mess, no doubt about it. Can be no doubt that some Hamas fighters did kill civilians. There is also no doubt about it that Israeli soldiers killed huge amounts of Israeli civilians in counterfire and in indiscriminate attacks on the Hamas fighters who were holding civilians. So it was a very messy day, but I would see that day nonetheless as being an act of resistance and defiance. that I celebrate. The thing is, Hamas cannot just be dismissed straightforwardly as being a terrorist organization. Hamas, at its core, believes in the necessity of resistance. Resistance both in order to push back the offenses of Israel, and also resistance in order to appeal for international solidarity. Now, they have been quite flexible about the forms of resistance they take, including strike action, including mobilizations on the streets, mass mobilizations on the streets, and yes, including what we would call terrorist acts. I also very clearly don't support their politics. I have never supported the politics of the leadership of any national liberation movement in history, to be frank. But I do see Hamas as being the legitimate leadership of Palestinian resistance.
I'm going to put you there, Gary, because I think that's a point, unless you want to just add a final sentence just to wrap up.
I'll see if I can come in later.
All right. Thanks very much, Gary. So if people can continue to raise their hands and come in to speak, while you do that, I just want to read out a question that Kirsty has put in the chat. Paraphrasing slightly, but I think the question is whether there's any way of avoiding the terrible outcome of ethnic cleansing of the kind that we saw in Bosnia, hundreds of thousands of people killed, having to leave their homes, or is the situation too far gone already to avoid that outcome? And maybe that's something that Moshé can address as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call Soraya in to speak, and then we've had maybe 4 or 5 speakers, so maybe at that point I'll call Moshé back in to respond to some of the points that have been raised. So Soraya, go ahead.
Just to raise a couple of points, and forgive me if I don't get colleagues' names right. I think it was, sorry, John was talking about reactions being liberal. I mean, I think that's true, because there hasn't really been a communist/socialist response, or at least it's only been very fragmented. But not as I claim to have read everything, but I haven't seen anything that's actually been along class lines. Essentially, of course, we do need only a socialist revolution can resolve the problems of the working class, either in Israel or anywhere. But I think it's wrong to discount what the trade unions can do. I mean, actually, the call for the banning of export of weapons to Israel, for me, is twofold. It has importance in 2 senses. One, it's important because if it's carried out, it means that there won't be further weapons going to further the war in Israel. The war against the Palestinians. But also, it's an important part of the power of the working class. Okay, it might be a small thing, but it's still it's something that workers can do and can demand. So I don't think it should be discarded. I don't think, and I'm just coming back on some of the things about you can't look towards the Israeli working class. Well, I think that's, at the moment, it's going to be very fractured. I just don't know, and we don't get enough information, do we, about what's going on there. But the superficial reaction of people interviewed, obviously that's a limited number, but on the news, the actions of Hamas wiped out the solidarity, I think, for quite a long period, the actions in October. And I'm not sure that I would agree with Gary. There's a brave act of resistance. I don't think you can underestimate the extent of what the October actions have done to actually quash the support for Palestinians by Israeli workers, and not just workers, but maybe some liberals in the Israeli middle class. I just don't think that can be sort of covered over. And so for me, that's a really important setback, and you're alienating those who should be your allies. Now, it's extremely difficult, and I'm not trying to make it simplistic, very complicated situation, but that must be surely what communists, socialists are calling for, because the only people who can represent the interests of the working class are the working class, and anything else is just a temporary fig leaf, isn't it? I think so. It's right. It's difficult to argue for class unity. I don't think it's something we can say, well, okay, because it's extremely difficult and nigh on impossible at the moment, you don't argue for it. Just as it may be difficult to argue that we need a revolution and to get rid of capitalism doesn't mean we don't argue for it. It's just very, very difficult and very complicated. And just finally, I'm not sure that we can again class Hamas as the legitimate leadership of the Palestinians. I'll be corrected on that, but let's not forget Hamas has been financed, I don't know if it still is, but in the past by Israeli capitalism. It's not in any way a working class socialist. We all know that it would be extremely repressive in terms of Islamic fundamentalism and how things would end up, in fact, if there were victory. Palestinian workers would not be supported to carry out a revolution and overthrow capitalism by the leadership of Hamas. So I think it's a lot more complicated. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Soraya. So what I'm going to do now, Moshé, if that's all right with you, I'm going to call you in for 4 minutes to respond to some of the points. And then I've got a list of people who I'll call in to speak after that, John, Virginia, and then Nick. So is that all right, Moshé? If I give you 4 minutes, I'll be quite strict with you this time.
4 minutes is not going to be enough. If you want me to talk about the socialist attitude, what socialists should demand or look forward to, 4 minutes is not going to be enough. But I will do my best.
Thank you.
I want to tie together the first and last contributions. What is the socialist position? I think let me go back to what I said at the beginning. The nature of this colonization, which is exclusive of the indigenous people. What it means is that unlike South Africa, where the regime of apartheid needed the indigenous people as its exploitable working force, and therefore it gave a lot of power to the indigenous people, and they were able to overthrow in one way or another the apartheid regime without, however, a socialist revolution. I don't think that a capitalist solution or a solution to the present conflict within capitalism is at all possible. The only possible solution is within a socialist framework. Let me explain briefly why. Any benign solution to the conflict requires the overthrow of the Zionist regime. No external force is able to overthrow this regime. It cannot be overthrown from the outside. It can only be overthrown with the participation, with the consent, with the agreement of the Israeli working class itself. Now, in the present situation, why should the Israeli working class support overthrowing the Zionist regime? If you look at the much vaunted one-state solution, it sounds wonderful. Everybody lives in equality. But what it would mean for the Israeli working class is giving up its position as a class within a privileged nation, a privileged position nationally, while being an exploited class, but without change in its exploited status. That is to say, a capitalist resolution or overthrow of Zionism would turn the Israeli working class from an exploited class with national privileges to an exploited class without national privileges. Why should it agree? The situation would be completely different within a transformed socialist region. The Israeli working class would exchange its position as an exploited class with national privileges to part of a ruling class without national privileges. This is a kind of deal that is makes sense, that would make sense for the Israeli working class. There are certain historical precedents, certain historical events that point in the possibility, at least logical possibility of this kind of evolution, going back to the demonstrations that occurred in Israel on a very huge scale in 2011. There was a high degree of solidarity between the Israeli working class and the working classes of Egypt and Syria. So it may be that a participation of the Israeli working class in a benign solution for this conflict is possible within a socialist framework. It is not possible within a capitalist framework. Okay. The second point that I want to make is the following. There is no need, there is no point in minimizing the fact that what Hamas did on the 7th of October was atrocities. These were atrocities. There's no need to prettify this. And the simple fact is that colonization, national oppression, brutalizes both colonizer and colonized. They both commit atrocities. This is the lesson of history. The difference is that it is not symmetric, that the colonizer, and in this case the Zionist regime, is much more powerful and is therefore able to commit much bigger, much more widespread atrocities than the colonized. What Hamas did on the 7th of October was manual atrocities, steeping its hands literally in blood. What the Israeli regime is doing is massive atrocities aided by superior technology. I mean, this is the lesson of history. Look, in the colonization of North America, if you look at the American Declaration of Independence, how are the local indigenous people referred to? They are called, in the Declaration of Independence, the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Do you think that this characterization of so-called Indian atrocities was invented, was a fantasy? It wasn't a fantasy. There were atrocities committed. There's no need to prettify this. The colonization brutalizes the indigenous people, and on a much bigger scale, the settlers.
Moshé, I'm going to.
Happens, and this is in the present condition. There's no need to try to use cosmetic on this on this situation. So yes, I mean, as we pointed out, I mean, moral judgment needs to be made, but we have to understand that the situation is not symmetric in another respect. That the actual cause of what is happening is the occupation itself. As we pointed out 56 years ago, this is what is going to happen. If you continue with the occupation, then there's going to be terror and counter-terror. And this is what is happening now. I mean, it's not a way of justifying morally or any need to justify morally the acts of terror, but to explain their causes.
Thanks very much, Moshé. Right, so I've got John first to speak, then it's going to be Virginia, and then Nick, and then we'll see where we are after that. So, John, go ahead.
Good evening. Yeah, that was very interesting, Moshé. Your analysis of different clothing. I've kind of been wary of the situation regarding Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. In as much as that, I mean, Hamas is actually a creation in some ways. Well, I mean, the United States, Israel used it apparently because they didn't want to negotiate any longer with El Fatah or the PLO, which were more of a secular movement, I believe. But at this point, Palestinian Authority, president, he's still talking about the two-state solution, as is Europe and as is, of course, the United States. Mm-hmm. So it kind of just it would seem that the colonialists have actually divided the Palestinians, divide and rule. Turn them against each other in as much as Hamas has its idea, has its history, has its relationship. The way that Netanyahu actually, used Hamas in order to, go the way he's gone. I'm getting a bit sort of muddled here because there's so many different aspects to it. But I was just wondering whether you could say something a bit more about that conflict, if there's a conflict, and what you're getting on the media. On one hand, we're getting Hamas rubbishing the two-state solution. On the other hand, you're still getting the Palestinian Authority talking about it and saying that is the only answer. So, yeah, that's it.
Thanks very much, Sean. That was admirably brief. So I'm going to call Virginia in next.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, I agree with Moshé's analysis of repression, resistance, more repression, more resistance, horrific repression, horrific resistance, and explosion. I don't know what the Hamas action, though, did for the Palestinians, but I think that, Amira Haas wrote a piece not long after it happened, and she said that she, a Palestinian friend of hers who wanted to remain nameless, said that she couldn't see how a prisoner exchange for how many 4,000 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners there are, would be somehow their release, that they would be happy to be released in the wake of the devastation that occurred to the Palestinians in Gaza. But also, I think that what was heartening, yeah, of course, the working class, yeah, but in any case, yes, but to keep on demonstrating, and I think that the actions of sort of not in my name Jewish people in the United States, not just occupying Washington, but occupying Grand Central Station, and making very powerful speeches, and that sort of triggered, didn't it, similar actions in stations in London and Britain, I think in Sweden too. I don't know how many other places. And and there have been people who have refused to allow military equipment to be, shipped to Israel. But I just think that all we can definitely do and have to do and must do, in however many avenues can be, accessed, is to keep on, not stop, protesting against this, and I've been on 4 demonstrations, and you come back and you listen to the radio, and it's just surreal, the difference between the ways they're reported and what happens on the peaceful demonstration. I mean, it's just, extraordinary. So yeah, I can't say anything other than that. The only thing that positively that everybody can do is to keep on keeping on, and that's about all I have to say. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Virginia. So in terms of where we go from here with the time tonight, or ordinarily we would finish, the plan was to finish at 8:30. I can see, though, that there's a number of comrades who haven't spoken yet, who'd like to speak, and maybe one or two who'd like to just come back in and make some very brief additional points. And so if it's agreeable to everybody, I'd like to propose that we just continue until 20 to 9. So we add 10 minutes on at the end of the meeting, and that will, of course, give Moshé the chance to respond properly to things as well. If anybody does need to leave promptly at 8:30, then apologies for that. But as I say, the meeting is being recorded, and so you will be able to just catch up on any final points that you might have missed if that was the case. So I'm going to call in Nick and then Will. So Nick first, please.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Ed. Comrades, I agree pretty much entirely with what Moshé has said, his explanation for the history, and also his comments in response to the questions. In my opinion, we're facing an almost impossible situation, and for those who don't have any socialist perspective, it must be an absolute nightmare. Well, it's a nightmare for all of us watching what is going on in Gaza and watching, perhaps with another eye, what's continuing to go on in the West Bank with daily brutality, killings, expulsions, and so on. So I agree with Virginia that what we have to do immediately is carry on protesting and ensure that there's the biggest opposition to what Israel is doing, the mass murder, the ethnic cleansing, the driving of the population of Gaza, 2.3 million in a short stretch of land, into half that, the continued destruction. We can have an impact, and I think the trade union action in stopping arms and doing other things, we should try to build that. So that's concrete things that we can do now. The more difficult thing is obviously, what do we do in the long term? And it may be that we can't do anything. I think there are things that we can do, and it may sound very abstract. We have to do what we can to try to build support for a socialist solution in the Middle East. And I agree completely with Moshé on what he said. There is no solution to the national question in the Middle East, and therefore no solution to the national question for the Palestinians, in my opinion, on the basis of capitalism, for the reasons that Moshé explained very briefly, and I don't have time to develop. The answer has got to be not just the independent role of the working class, but the independent role of the working class armed with a socialist program. Now, that may seem pie in the sky, and it may lead some socialists, even some Marxists, to look for other forces to do something, anything. My argument is that that does not help. Our role is to understand and to explain, and I think Moshé's done that, and we can explain Hamas's action on the 7th of October against the background of the history of repression, but also, perhaps it's not really been developed, the complete failure in the past of the Fatah leadership of the PLO, the complete failure of the Stalinist communist parties and Arab nationalism in the region. And of course, we can't look to the US or the UN or the EU or any other European or Western capitalist to solve the problem. They are backing Israel, and that doesn't look likely to stop. We can't look to any Arab ruler. The Arab rulers have abandoned the Palestinian masses. And so therefore the question comes, well, what is the answer? And I'm afraid, difficult as it is, the only answer is to build support for socialism and for the overthrowing of the Zionist regime in Israel and the rotten, corrupt, pro-imperialist Arab rulers across North Africa and the Middle East and the crescent surrounding it. And in my opinion, it actually hinders that work if we try to give any support or praise for what Hamas did on the 7th of October. It's one thing to understand, and it's one thing to put the responsibility on the colonizers, but to defend the atrocities, as I would call them, as Moshé did, of Hamas, and to prettify them, as I think Gary did, is not going to help the cause of the Palestinians or the international working class one iota. And what Hamas did, it's impossible to really understand that they did not appreciate what the retaliation would be of Israel. Israel has always used every opportunity, 47, 48 and 67, to expand and to ethnically cleanse. And this was a gift to Netanyahu, who, as Moshé said, was under the cosh as a criminal indicted. The civil society in Israel was split down the middle. I don't accept the argument that the Israeli working class can't be won. It might be difficult, it might be hard, but the Israeli state is based on class divisions. The working class may be at the moment drawn towards Zionism and participate in the generally in the repression and oppression of the Palestinians. But what Hamas did, in my opinion, on the 7th was to cut across the growing class divisions and the civil division between classes in Israel, and has driven large sections of people who previously would have been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause right back into Netanyahu's orbit. Netanyahu surrounded.
Cut you off there, Nick.
I'm going to stop. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Nick. So I'm going to call Will in to speak. Go ahead, Will.
I'll be brief. As brief as I can. Cut me off, Ed. I think what we're looking at then is the strategy for defeating the Zionist state, which is what it is in my view, involves the dismantling of the Zionist state. It involves the destruction of the Israeli state machinery. If we want a kind of a socialist federation of the Middle East, which is something that I think I agree is the only way through this, however far away that may seem. Now, the issue for me then is who's going to do it? Who's going to do that? And I find it difficult to believe that we should discount the whole of the Israeli working class in all of its composition in that destruction of the Israeli state. Otherwise, we're in a situation where what you're saying is that there would be a civil war across the countries that we're talking about, and indeed a driving out of an aristocracy of labour and a ruling class of a state of that area. So I just can't see that as a viable strategy. So I think that some engagement with the Israeli working class is absolutely crucial. The second thing is about Hamas. Over the period of imperialism, the kind of compression that people have experienced, the oppression, the weight of imperialism in different parts of the world has produced very many different responses. And in particular, I mean, you can think of the Khmer Rouge, you can think of the Shining Path, you can think of the Taliban, you can think of all these organizations, and I wouldn't regard any of those as legitimate leaders of working class movements. And I wouldn't regard Hamas as the legitimate leadership of the Palestinian revolution. It is, as Marx would say, the cry of the oppressed through the voice of religion. And it's, in my view, that kind of leadership is deeply reactionary. And we shouldn't say that we give it a tick next to it. And I think the final thing I want to say is I really like the idea of exclusionary colonialism. It really sums up what's going on. And thanks for that. I'll change my language in future, Moshé.
Thanks very much, Will. So that's all those are all the comrades who haven't spoken already. What I'd propose to do now is just give Gary and John McAnulty, who've been waiting very patiently, a brief opportunity just to add anything further or respond to any points that have been made before we move on to giving Moshé an opportunity to respond. And then, of course, at the end of the meeting, I'll tell you what's coming up in the next of our series of discussions in a fortnight's time. So, Gary, if I could ask you, I'm going to give you 90 seconds. I know it's very brief, and I'm sorry for that, but if you can do your best, and I'll cut you off.
Two brief points then. Hamas is the actual leadership of the Palestinian resistance. Hamas would not be able to play the role that it does if it didn't have mass support amongst the Palestinian community. It came into prominence and displaced Fatah and the PLO precisely because Fatah and the PLO gave up on resistance and gave in the towel and sold out. And that's the reason why Fatah came to the fore, and they still are the actual leadership of the resistance with support. So, but that's just putting that to one side. I want to look at what's actually happened in response to the last month's events. We have seen a huge mobilization across the world on the streets of the working class. Right? This is a mass mobilization of the working class. If we look at what's been going on in this country, we have seen hundreds of thousands of young working class people. I would say a majority of young working class Black women actually on the streets and not showing any liberal emotions. I wouldn't describe the sentiments that are being expressed by those demonstrators as being liberal at all. It is true, as John said, that the leadership is prone to being liberal, and we need a working class socialist leadership, absolutely. But then if we look at what's actually happened within our labor movement, we've had a huge split within the labor movement between the leadership and the mass of people within our movement. And who knows where that's going to go. Now, this is what happens. You can't predict where these things will go. Yes, we have to inject socialist leadership into this massive mobilization, but an act of resistance in Palestine can lead to all kinds of things in the broader Middle East and around the world. And I think that this is completely fractured the status quo of world politics.
Thank you, Gary. That's, I'm sure, a conversation that we'll continue having about the significance of it. John, go ahead. Same for you. 90 seconds, please. You're on mute, comrade.
Okay. The first duty of socialists, beyond anything else, is to say what you see. Now, what we see is that the Hamas uprising involved atrocity, but its aim and its purpose and its function wasn't atrocity. It wasn't a crowd of savages jumping out from the reservation and eating babies. It was a military organization who inflicted an intelligence defeat on the Israeli state, inflicted a military defeat on the Israeli state, and whose main activity was against the Israeli military. Now, what the Israeli state and the Western press has done is say, oh no, this was the savages killing civilians, eating babies, and that explains what happened since. What happened since is what the Israeli state always does. The Israeli state is looking for attempts to ethnically cleanse the area. That's its aim. That explains what it's doing now. It does this every time. Its aim is the Palestinian civilians, not the military organizations. And in fact, there's not really any strong indication, that they have significantly engaged with Hamas in Gaza. There's no sign of mass Gaza casualties. And what you see in front of your TV screens is the destruction of hospitals and the killing of men, women, and children en masse. And that's not by accident. It's not even honestly reported then. That's what the Israelis want to do. The hospitals want to have to close because they're taking over the area.
Yeah.
And what's inside of that is a real difficulty for them and imperialism in general, which is A, what are they going to do now? And B, there's a boiling point all over the region which could break at any time. I think there was a million March demonstration in Lebanon demanding that Hezbollah intervene more directly.
I'm gonna cut you off there, John, because I really want to hand over to Moshé and give Moshé a quick time. So Moshé, if you want to take 8 or 9 minutes, I know it's impossible to respond to every point raised. But whatever you'd like to say by way of summing up, I'm sure we'd gratefully receive.
Maybe I can fit it within the time. I think it's possible. First of all, a few points about Hamas, whether it is or it isn't the leadership of the Palestinian resistance. First of all, it is now known and widely advertised fact that the Netanyahu government and Netanyahu personally actually fostered Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The idea was to divide the Palestinian leadership and to prevent the mention even of a two-state solution, which in any case is a delusion that is not going to happen in any way. Secondly, we have reliable opinion polls to indicate whether or not Hamas reflects the views of the Palestinian masses. Now, the interesting fact is that the support for Hamas within the population of the Gaza Strip prior to the 7th of October was smaller than the support for Hamas in the West Bank. Remember that actually Hamas won the last Palestinian general elections. That was in 2006, right? And it won it throughout the Palestinian occupied territories. Not only in the Gaza Strip, it won a victory. It was prevented from actually forming a government, except it managed to actually snatch the power in the Gaza Strip. The reason why it is less popular in the Gaza Strip than in the West Bank, even less popular. So it's a minority, by the way, minority support, but the minority is bigger in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip. It is because it is a repressive in the Gaza Strip. It is a repressive government. It is repressive in social terms. It is repressive in political terms. It is an oppressor of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, it is only an absent force. But either the one or the other doesn't mean that Hamas is the leader of the Palestinian resistance in all sorts of ways. First of all, don't forget the mass unarmed resistance that occurred in the Gaza Strip in 2018, the big March of Return, which was unarmed and supported by masses of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. It was responded to by the Israeli regime in a brutal way. Although it was unarmed, they killed and maimed the demonstrators, including journalists, including disabled people, including journalists. Secondly, of course, the Palestinian Authority under Abbas is a quisling authority. It is not involved in any resistance whatsoever. It is actually a quisling arm of the Israeli regime. But in the West Bank, much of the resistance is carried out neither by Fatah nor by Hamas, but by self-organized, locally organized groups of young people who carry out armed resistance to the Israeli occupation. They are, of course, branded as terrorists by the Israeli regime, but what they are involved in is armed resistance to the Israeli occupation. This is happening in Nablus, in Jenin, and in other parts of the West Bank. Finally, regarding the socialist solution, in my view, it is not enough to say fight for socialism and that will be the only solution of the problem. There is, I think, a need to raise a set of minimal demands. And in this respect, the demand for a secular democratic state, while it is not feasible in real terms, because it is a capitalist solution, it advocates an impossibility, which I've gone into. I don't want to repeat the reasons why. It has an advantage that it actually embarrasses, it challenges the existing authorities, both the Israeli authority and its allies worldwide, its protectors, its sponsors, in terms of proposing something that looks very reasonable. I think we socialists should not advocate an impossible solution and a capitalist solution for the conflict, but we can raise certain minimal conditions for any solution at all to be acceptable. What I mean is the following: we should say any solution that would give equal individual rights and equal national rights to Palestinians and Israelis would be a good thing, would be acceptable. Why? What we require is equal rights. Now we know that equality of rights in the true sense cannot be realized under capitalism. But there's no harm in actually specifying we demand equal rights. That is a reasonable solution. By equal rights, I mean equal individual rights and equal national rights to the two national groups involved: the Israeli Jews, so-called Israeli Jews, the new Hebrew nation, and the Palestinian Arab nation. Equal rights. Now, finally, I want to say that the situation regarding the possibility of class solidarity between Israeli workers and Palestinian workers is not as illusory as it were, as utopian as all that. On the ground where Israeli Jewish workers and Palestinian workers find themselves in the same working place, there are a lot of cases of actual class solidarity and joint action and real friendship arising on a class basis. It doesn't happen on the arena of national politics, but on the arena of the actual class struggle, very often you find real class solidarity and friendship between workers belonging to the two nationalities. Some of them Palestinian Arab workers from within Israel, and some even from the occupied territories. I know of many cases. It is remarkable that when workers actually meet at the point of production, class solidarity very often overcomes the national animosity that is preached by the government. So, and I already alluded to the manifestations of solidarity that occurred in 2011 between Israeli demonstrators who were calling for solidarity with the Egyptian and Syrian working class. So the prospect is not as bleak as all that. I mean, there is a spark of hope with which I would like to end this.
Thank you very much for that, Moshé. And I can see the entire meeting applauding and very grateful to that. And thank you to everyone, in fact, for contributing and discussing and developing that discussion throughout tonight. I got a lot out of it. I'm sure everybody else has as well. And once again, thank you very much to Moshé for making the time to speak. I want to just conclude.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, the pleasure's all ours. Now, I want to just conclude tonight by just giving everyone a brief look at what's coming up in the Talking About Socialism series. So the next meeting will be on Monday, the 27th of November. We'll be back to our usual start time of 7:30. It will be in the confirmation email that you get once you've registered. On that date, we'll have John McAnally, who is a former president of the PCS, Civil Servants Union, and he's going to be introducing a discussion on the state of the unions, reviewing the position of the trade union movement in Britain, looking at the forthcoming battles it will face, and what role socialists should play in that. The meeting after that, a fortnight after, on the 11th of December, again, 7:30, usual time, Chris Strafford, who's spoken at meetings before, will be introducing a discussion on defending democratic rights. He's going to be taking a look at the increasing authoritarianism of the government and the moves to ban so-called hate marches, which are, of course, in reality, marches in solidarity with Palestine, moves to ban them, and the other inhumane policies that are going along with that. The important question, of course, or one of the important questions, is whether anything will be any better under a Starmer-led Labour government. So that will be an excellent discussion as well. We're looking forward to those two meetings. So to conclude, thanks very much, everyone, for attending and bearing with us in the discussion. Very much looking forward to seeing everybody at the next meeting in 2 weeks' time. And have a great evening, everyone.